Hey there, my dear friends. It's Eva, your 65-year-old neighbor from Eufaula, Alabama, sitting here with a cup of Folgers and a heart full of stories. Welcome to my 5th little video. Can you believe I'm still figuring this YouTube thing out? I'm a bit of a rookie, so bear with me if I fumble a tad. Alright, y'all are like my old book club gals, gathering round the kitchen table, sharing laughs and tears over sweet tea. Today, I want to tell you a story that's been living in me, about love, loss, and finding light when the world feels dark. It's for us women who've carried heavy loads but still keep walking. So, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's talk like we always do, heart to heart. Hit that subscribe button if you're with me, and let's get started. The wind cut through my thin sweater like a knife that November evening in Willow Creek, Ohio. I stood in the cramped room next to the washing machine, clutching my mother's old handkerchief, its faded lace soft against my fingers. The house on Maple Street was alive with anger, Lydia's voice slicing through the air, sharp and unforgiving. "You've ruined everything we built," Maggie, she screamed from the kitchen. Avery, my granddaughter, hurled a sneaker at the wall behind me, the thud echoing like a gunshot. Jim, my only son, stood silent, his head bowed, arms crossed, as if he could wish himself invisible. And there, in the shadowed hallway, was Luke, my 17-year-old grandson, his eyes red-rimmed, gripping his phone so tight I thought it might crack. Nobody stopped them. Nobody spoke for me. So I did the only thing I could. I packed a bag, left the key on the table, and walked out into the cold. I'm Margaret Harper, but folks call me Maggie. I've lived 62 years, raised a son through lean times, and thought I'd seen every kind of hurt a heart could hold. But that night, as I stepped onto the porch and the door clicked shut behind me, I learned there was a new kind of pain, one that comes when your own family turns you into a stranger. I didn't cry. Not then. I just kept walking, the moonlight casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalk, my old canvas bag slung over my shoulder. I told myself, "Maggie, you'll find the light. Just keep going." But deep down, I wondered if I was walking away from the only home I'd ever known, or towards something better I couldn't yet see. Let me take you back to that moment, to the house that held so many memories and so much betrayal. It was a Tuesday, the kind of grey autumn day where the air smells of damp leaves and wood smoke. The kitchen smelled of Folgers coffee gone cold, the pot still sitting on the counter from breakfast. I was folding napkins, same as I did every morning, when it all unraveled. The TV in the living room droned on, some rerun of Jeopardy nobody was watching, its familiar jingle a strange comfort against the storm brewing around me. Lydia stormed in, her beige trench coat flapping, her manicured nails clutching a letter from the insurance office. Her face was flushed, eyes blazing like she'd been waiting for this fight. "You couldn't keep your mouth shut, could you?" she spat, slamming the letter on the table. "One phone call, Maggie, and you've torn down everything we've worked for." I set the napkin down, my hand steady even though my heart was pounding. "Lydia, I don't know what you're talking about," I said, keeping my voice low. I'd learned over the years that raising it only made things worse. "Don't play dumb," Avery snapped, bursting into the room. She was 22, all sharp edges and attitude, her phone clutched like a weapon. "You blabbed about Dad's side jobs to the insurance people. Now they're cutting his disability checks. We're screwed, and it's your fault." I looked at Jim, standing behind Lydia, his flannel shirt rumpled, his eyes fixed on the floor, my boy, the one I'd rocked through fevers and driven to baseball practice in a beat-up Chevy. Wouldn't meet my gaze. "Jim," I said softly, "what's this about?" He exhaled, a sharp sound through his nose, but said nothing. Lydia stepped closer, her perfume something floral and too strong filling the space between us. "You told them Jim works on the side," she said, her voice low now. Dangerous. You know he's not supposed to report income. They're freezing our benefits. Maggie, the rent, the groceries, everything gone. Because you couldn't keep quiet. My stomach twisted. I remembered the call, a week ago from the clinic. I'd gone in for a blood pressure check, and the woman on the phone asked about household income. I'd said, plain as day, that Jim did odd jobs fixing cars, painting fences to help cover bills. I didn't think it was a secret. I didn't think it was wrong. I was just answering her questions. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Intentions don't pay the bills. Lydia snapped. You've always been careless. Maggie, always meddling where you don't belong. Claire, Lydia's younger sister, lounged in the doorway, sipping coffee from my favorite mug. She smirked, her gym logo water bottle dangling from one hand. Well, say something. Maggie, you proud of yourself? I felt the room shrink, the walls pressing in like the weight of their words. Avery grabbed another sneaker from the table and threw it, missing me by inches. Get out, she said, her voice cold. You've done enough damage. Lydia nodded, her lips tight. You're not staying here another night. I stood there, the napkin still in my hand, and looked at Jim again. Say something, I whispered. He shifted, his boots scuffing the linoleum. But he didn't look up. You should have known better, he muttered. And that was all he gave me. Luke hadn't moved from the hallway. His earbuds dangled around his neck. His hoodie pulled up like a shield. He didn't speak, didn't step forward, but his eyes followed me, wide and pleading. I wanted to tell him it was okay, that I'd be fine, but the words stuck in my throat. I turned and walked to my room, the hallway light flickering as I passed. The space I'd called mine was barely a room at all, just a corner near the laundry, with plastic bins for my clothes and a single dresser drawer for my things. Lydia's winter coats and Avery's extra shoes filled the closet. I didn't complain. I never did. I'd told myself it was enough that they let me stay. I packed slowly, folding 2 sweaters, a pair of jeans, my blood pressure pills. I tucked Jim's old school photo, him at 6, gap-toothed and grinning, into my purse. My mother's handkerchief went in my pocket, its familiar weight a quiet comfort. The rest I left behind. As I zipped the bag, I heard them in the kitchen, their voices low but sharp, planning, venting, maybe even celebrating. Claire's laugh cut through the wall. Took long enough. I walked back down the hallway, past Luke. He hadn't moved, his water bottle still in hand. I'm leaving, I said quietly. He nodded once, his jaw tight, like he'd known this was coming. I wanted to hug him, to tell him I'd be back for him, but I didn't, not yet. The front door creaked as I opened it. The air hit me, cold and damp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. I stepped outside, the porch light casting a weak glow on the steps. Nobody followed. Nobody called my name. The door shut behind me, and I was alone. I think back now to 1978 when Jim was just 5, and a blizzard swept through Willow Creek. I'd wrapped him in my coat, held him close as the wind howled, and promised I'd never let him feel cold. That night, as I walked down Maple Street, I wondered why I'd let myself feel so cold for so long. I'd given everything, my savings, my dreams, my years to build a family, and yet here I was, with nothing but a bag and a broken heart. The street was quiet. The houses dark except for the occasional flicker of a TV. Willow Creek had always been a small town, the kind where folks waved from porches and swapped stories at the diner. But that night, it felt like a stranger's place, the familiar oaks lining the road standing like silent judges. I passed the old community center, its sign peeling, and remembered the summer fairs where I'd bought Jim cotton candy. Those days seemed like someone else's life now. I didn't have a plan, no car, no savings to speak of. Just a few crumpled bills in my purse and a stubborn streak that had kept me going through harder times. I thought, doesn't it matter? I'd find a place to sleep, I told myself, even if it was a bus stop bench. But as I walked, the stars above seemed to whisper, "Keep going, Maggie. There's light beyond this storm." I clung to that thought, letting it steady my steps. The memory of Luke's face stayed with me, those red-rimmed eyes begging me to stay. I wondered what he was doing now, if he was safe, if he hated me for leaving. I wanted to go back, to pull him into my arms and tell him he was enough, that he was loved. But I couldn't, not yet. I had to find my own strength first, so I could be strong for him. I passed the closed-up ice cream shop on Main Street, the one where I used to take Jim for chocolate cones. The sign was faded now, the windows boarded, but I could still hear his laughter, see his sticky fingers. That was the life I'd fought for, the one I thought would last. But families aren't just houses or blood. They're the people who see you, who choose you. And that night, I realized I'd been living in a house, not a home. I stopped at the corner, the wind tugging at my hair, and looked back one last time. The house on Maple Street was out of sight, swallowed by the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just turned and kept walking, the handkerchief in my pocket a reminder of my mother's words, "When they don't value you, find another door." I was finding that door, one step at a time. I don't know what lies ahead, but I know this: I didn't walk away because I was weak. I walked away because I was done letting them make me small. I was done being the shadow in their story. I was Maggie Harper, and I was going to write my own. As I reached the edge of town, the stars seemed brighter, like they were cheering me on. I thought of my mother, her jazz record spinning late at night, Ella Fitzgerald's voice filling our old kitchen. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. I smiled, just a little. Maybe I'd find my swing yet. I don't know if you've ever had to walk away from something you loved, something you thought was forever. But if you have, I hope you'll share your story with me. If this moment in my life touched you, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Tell me what keeps you going when everything falls apart. Your words might just be the light someone else needs to keep walking. Every morning in that house on Maple Street, I'd wake up to the hum of the washing machine, its steady thump like a heartbeat in the quiet. It was my corner of the world, that little room tucked behind the laundry, with plastic bins for my clothes and a single drawer for my keepsakes. The air smelled of detergent and dust, and the vent above my bed rattled like it was whispering secrets. I'd lie there for a moment, listening to Willow Creek wake up outside the distant bark of a dog, the soft clatter of a neighbor's trash can before getting up to start the day. I'd make coffee, fold the towels Lydia left in the dryer, and wipe down the kitchen counters before anyone stirred. Nobody asked me to. Nobody thanked me. But it was my way of feeling like I belonged, like I was still part of this family I'd given everything to build. I'm Maggie Harper, and if you're still with me after that cold night I walked away, I want to take you back to the days before it all fell apart. Those were the days when I thought I could still hold things together, when I believed a little more scrubbing, a little more silence, might keep the cracks from spreading. The house on Maple Street wasn't just a house, it was a dream I'd poured my heart into. Back when Jim was 22 and begging for help to buy it, I'd handed over my savings, every penny from years at the grocery store, thinking it'd be a place for us all. But dreams have a way of fading, and by the time I was living in that laundry room, I was starting to see the truth. I wasn't family anymore. I was just the help. The house itself was nothing fancy, a 2-story with peeling white paint and a front yard that never quite grew green. Inside, the walls were covered in floral wallpaper, curling at the edges, and the hardwood floors creaked under every step. The kitchen was the heart of it, with a linoleum table, a radio that only picked up one station, and a coffee pot that hissed like it was annoyed. I'd start my day there, brewing Folgers, the bitter smell filling the air as the sun peeked through the yellowed curtains. By 7, the house was still quiet, except for the occasional thud of Luke's footsteps as he grabbed a Pop-Tart and headed out, his hoodie up, eyes glued to his phone. Avery slept till 10, always complaining about some headache or job she didn't want. Lydia glided in around 11, her heels clicking, already checking her phone and muttering about needing peace and quiet. I tried to be invisible. That was the rule, even if nobody said it out loud. I'd move softly, wiping crumbs from the counter, folding laundry in the corner, keeping my radio low so Ella Fitzgerald's voice didn't carry. I didn't ask questions, didn't pry because I'd learned years ago that questions made me a problem. Jim worked nights sometimes, or so he said. There were weeks when he stayed home, claiming his back was acting up or some paperwork needed sorting. I didn't push. I saw the tension in his eyes when the bills piled up, the way Lydia's voice sharpened when money ran low. I told myself it wasn't my place to fix it, not anymore. But it wasn't just Jim and Lydia. There was Claire, Lydia's younger sister, who showed up so often she might as well have lived there. She'd walk in without knocking, pour herself coffee I'd bought, and make little jabs that stung like paper cuts. Still hanging around, Maggie she'd say, her gym water bottle swinging as she leaned on the counter. This place is getting crowded. I'd smile, nod, and keep folding towels. But her words lingered, like a splinter under the skin. Avery loved Claire. They were thick as thieves, giggling over TikTok videos while I scrubbed pots. The house felt like a club I wasn't invited to, and every day I felt a little smaller. I remember one morning, maybe a month before that awful night, when things felt heavier than usual. I was in the kitchen, slicing bread for toast, when Claire strolled in, wearing Lydia's silk robe like she owned the place. She poured coffee, leaned against the counter, and gave me that half smile of hers. "Hey, Maggie," she said, sweet as vinegar. "You talked to anyone at the clinic lately?" I looked up, surprised. "Just the insurance lady for my checkup," I said. "Why?" She shrugged, sipping her coffee. "Just curious. They ask nosy questions, don't they? About who lives here, what everyone does." Her eyes flicked to mine, sharp and knowing. They asked about income, the usual. I said, spreading butter on the bread. I told them Jim's on disability, but he does odd jobs to help out. Nothing strange. Her smile widened. "Just a fraction. Hope you didn't say anything they could twist. You know how the government is, always looking for a reason to mess things up." I frowned, but let it go. I didn't think much of it then, just went back to my toast, the knife scraping softly against the crust, but something about the way Claire looked at me stuck, like she'd planted a seed and was waiting for it to grow. I didn't know it yet, but that seed would bloom into the fight that sent me packing. Living in that house was like walking on eggshells. Every step careful, every word measured. I'd learned to keep my head down, to let Lydia's complaints slide, to ignore Avery's eye rolls. But there were moments when I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. One evening, I was folding Jim's t-shirts in the laundry room when I heard Lydia on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low but sharp. "I don't care what the bank says. We need that money. And now, with Maggie here, it's just another mouth to feed." I froze, my hand still on the soft cotton, my heart sinking like a stone. I wasn't just a guest they saw me as a burden. I think back now to 1985 when Jim was a teenager. All gangly limbs and big dreams. We'd sit in our old apartment, eating Kraft mac and cheese, and he'd talk about becoming a mechanic, fixing cars like his dad used to. I'd work double shifts at the grocery store to pay for his shop classes. My feet aching, but my heart full. I'd thought those sacrifices would bind us forever, that he'd always see me the way he did back then, with eyes full of trust, but somewhere along the way, I'd become the woman in the laundry room, folding his clothes while he looked the other way. Luke was the only one who still saw me, or so I hoped. He was quiet, always tucked into his hoodie, earbuds in, but there were moments when he'd linger in the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water and giving me a small smile. Once, when I was wiping down the stove, he said, "You don't have to do all this, Grandma." I'd laughed, brushing it off. "Keeps me busy," I said, but his words warmed me, like a ray of sun through the clouds. I clung to those moments, to the hope that at least one person in that house didn't wish I'd disappear. But even Luke couldn't stop the tide. Lydia's complaints grew sharper, Avery's jabs more frequent. Claire was always there, stirring the pot, her laughter ringing through the house like a warning bell. I'd lie awake at night, the vent rattling above me, and wonder where I'd gone wrong. Had I been too soft, too trusting, I'd given Jim everything: my youth, my savings, my dreams of college, and now I was a stranger in his home. The loneliness was a quiet ache, like a bruise you don't notice until you press it. I remember one afternoon, sitting in the kitchen with my radio on low, Ella Fitzgerald singing Summertime. The sun slanted through the window, catching the dust motes in the air. And for a moment, I felt peace. I closed my eyes, picturing my mother's kitchen, the smell of her oatmeal cookies, the way she'd hum along to the radio. I was so lost in the memory that I didn't hear Lydia come in until she spoke. "Maggie, can you keep that thing down?" she said. Her voice clipped. She was checking her phone, her nails tapping the screen. "Some of us need to focus." I turned the knob, the music fading to a whisper. "Sorry," I said, my cheeks warm. "Didn't mean to bother you." She didn't look up. "You never do." "Do you?" she muttered, and walked out, her heels clicking on the floor. I sat there, staring at the radio, the peace gone. I wanted to tell her I wasn't trying to be a burden, that I was just trying to hold on to something, anything that felt like mine. But I didn't. I never did. I picked up a sponge and started scrubbing the sink, the cold water numbing my fingers, as if I could wash away the hurt. Looking back, I see now how those days were building to something, like a storm gathering on the horizon. I didn't know then that a single phone call would be the spark, that Claire's sly questions were a trap, that Lydia was waiting for an excuse to push me out. I just kept going, folding towels, brewing coffee, hoping that if I stayed quiet, stayed useful, they'd let me stay. But hope can be a fragile thing. And in that house, it was slipping through my fingers like sand. I didn't know it yet, but the day was coming when I'd have to choose stay and shrink, or walk away and find myself again. I didn't know it would hurt so much, or that it would lead me to a light I'd almost forgotten how to see. The kitchen on Maple Street was bathed in soft autumn light that Tuesday morning, the kind of light that makes you think everything might turn out okay. I was at the table, a mug of Folgers coffee cooling in my hands, the bitter steam curling up like a memory. The radio hummed low, Ella Fitzgerald's voice weaving through the air. And for a moment, I could almost pretend I was back in my mother's kitchen, where the world felt safe. But then the phone rang, a shrill sound that cut through the quiet, and everything changed. I didn't know it then, but that call would be the spark that set the house on fire, the one that would send me packing into the cold. I'm Maggie Harper, and if you've been walking with me through these memories, you know how heavy things were in that house. I was trying to hold on, to be the invisible thread stitching the family together. But I was starting to see the truth. Some things can't be mended, no matter how hard you try. That morning, as I answered the phone, I thought I was just doing what I always did, keeping things in order, answering questions, being honest. I didn't know I was handing them the match to burn me down. The woman on the line was polite, her voice clipped and professional, like she'd made 100 calls like this already. She was from the clinic, following up on my blood pressure checkup, needing to update my insurance file. I sat at the kitchen table, the linoleum cool under my elbows, and answered her questions as best I could. Address still Maple Street, Willow Creek, Ohio. Household members my son Jim, his wife Lydia, their kids Avery and Luke. Income. I paused, sipping my coffee, and said, Jim's on disability, but he does some odd jobs fixing cars, painting houses to help with the bills. It was the truth, plain and simple. I'd seen Jim come home with grease-stained hands, a few crumpled 20s in his pocket, proud to keep the lights on. I didn't think it was a secret, didn't think it mattered. The woman murmured, typed something, and moved on. The call lasted 10 minutes, maybe less. I hung up, set the phone down, and went back to wiping the counter, the sponge gliding over crumbs and coffee rings. Just another morning. I thought. I didn't notice Claire until she spoke. She was perched at the kitchen island, sipping coffee from my mug, her gym water bottle glinting in the sunlight. Her hair was pulled back, her smirk sharp as a blade. They ask a lot of weird questions. Don't they, she said, her voice casual but edged with something I couldn't place. I turned, startled. Didn't see you there, I said, rinsing the sponge. Yeah, just the usual address, income, that sort of thing. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. Hope you didn't say anything too spicy. Maggie. You know how the government loves to twist things? I frowned, wiping my hands on a dish towel. Nothing strange, I said. Just told them what they asked. Why? She shrugged, sliding off the stool with a grin that didn't reach her eyes. No reason. Just saying. They're tricky like that. She sauntered out, her sneakers squeaking on the floor, leaving me with a knot in my gut I couldn't explain. I shook it off, or tried to, and went back to my chores, folding napkins, sweeping the floor, keeping the house in order. But Claire's words lingered, like a shadow you can't quite step out of. That night, the house felt heavier than usual. Jim came home late, his boots dragging, his face lined with exhaustion. He barely looked at me, just grabbed a beer from the fridge and sank into the couch. Lydia was in the dining room, her phone glowing, her nails tapping as she texted. Avery was upstairs, music blaring through her door. Luke passed through the kitchen, earbuds in, giving me a quick nod before disappearing. I stood at the sink, scrubbing a pan, the hot water stinging my hands, and wondered if I'd imagined the tension or if it was real. The next day, a thick white envelope arrived, addressed to Jim. I was in the kitchen, slicing apples for a pie, when he opened it at the table. He skimmed the first page, his jaw tightening, then shoved the envelope under a stack of bills without a word. Lydia walked in, her heels clicking, and caught my eye. Her gaze was flat, cold, like she was looking through me. You say anything on that call, she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I set the knife down, my heart picking up speed. What, call your doctor or whatever, she said, crossing her arms. They asked about income. Right. What did you tell them? I swallowed. The air suddenly thick, just the truth. I said that Jim's on disability, but he does some side work. Oh, her eyes hardened, and something shifted in the room, like the air before a storm. You know he's not supposed to report income while on disability. Right, she said, her voice low and dangerous. My mouth went dry. I hadn't known, not really. I'd thought everyone did odd jobs to get by, that it was just how things worked in Willow Creek, where money was always tight. I didn't mean to get anyone in trouble. I said, my hands trembling, I was just answering their questions. Claire appeared in the doorway, leaning against, viewed strongly the frame, a smirk playing on her lips. Oops, she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. Cat's out of the bag now. Jim didn't look up, just kept staring at the table, his fingers curled around the beer can. I waited for him to say something, anything, to tell Lydia it was a mistake, that I hadn't meant harm. But he was silent, and that silence cut deeper than any words. I think back now to 1983 when Jim was 12, and I was working nights at the grocery store. I'd come home at dawn, my feet aching, and find him waiting with a glass of milk and a peanut butter sandwich. "Made it for you, Mom," he'd say, his grin wide enough to light up the room. I'd taught him to be honest, to tell the truth no matter what, because it was the only thing nobody could take away. But that morning, as Lydia's words hung in the air, I wondered if I'd taught him too well, or not well enough. Had I been wrong to speak the truth? Had I broken something I couldn't fix? The days after that call were like walking through fog. Lydia's voice grew sharper, her complaints more pointed. "Maggie, you're always in the way," she'd say, brushing past me in the hall. Avery took her cue, rolling her eyes when I offered to make dinner. "We're good. Grandma," she'd say. Her tone clipped, like I was an inconvenience. Claire was there almost every day. Her jabs less subtle now. "Bet you didn't think one call could cause this much trouble." "Huh. Maggie," she'd say, pouring herself another cup of my coffee. I kept to my routine, folding towels, scrubbing counters, trying to prove I wasn't what they thought. But every night, lying in my narrow bed, the vent rattling above me, I felt the weight of their anger pressing down. I'd clutch my mother's handkerchief, its lace worn thin, and think of her voice. "You're stronger than you know." Maggie. I wanted to believe her, but the truth was, I felt smaller every day, like a candle burning down to its last flicker. Luke was the only one who didn't change. He'd still linger in the kitchen sometimes, grabbing a Pop-Tart or a glass of water, his earbuds dangling. One morning, as I was sweeping the floor, he looked at me and said, "You okay?" "Grandma?" His voice was soft, almost lost in the hum of the radio. I smiled, brushing a strand of grey hair from my face. "I'm fine. Luke, just keeping busy." He nodded, but his eyes held a question he didn't ask. I wanted to tell him how much his small kindness meant, how it was a lifeline in that house of sharp edges. But I didn't. I just kept sweeping, the broom's rhythm a steady comfort. I didn't know it then, but that call had set something in motion, like a stone rolling downhill. Claire's smirk, Lydia's cold stare, Jim's silence, they were all pieces of a puzzle coming together, and I was the one they'd decided didn't fit. I'd thought honesty was a gift, a way to keep things clear in a world full of shadows. But in that house, honesty was a weapon, and I just handed it to them. Looking back, I see how naive I was, thinking a single truth wouldn't matter. I didn't know the system, didn't know how disability worked, didn't know my words could unravel their fragile balance. But I also see now that it wasn't just the call. It was me, my presence, my past, my love for Jim and Luke that they couldn't stand. I was a reminder of things they wanted to forget, and they were ready to erase me. I kept going, folding laundry, brewing coffee, hoping I could outlast their anger. But deep down, I knew the storm was coming, and I wasn't sure I'd be strong enough to weather it. All I could do was hold on to my mother's words, to the memory of Jim's sandwiches, to Luke's quiet smiles, and pray they'd be enough to carry me through. The air in the house on Maple Street turned thick after that phone call, like the calm before a thunderstorm you can feel in your bones. I'd wake up to the same hum of the washing machine, the same rattle of the vent above my bed, but something had shifted. The kitchen, once a place where I could lose myself in the rhythm of chores, felt like a stage where I was the unwanted extra. Lydia's words echoed in my head. "You've torn down everything we've worked for," and every glance from Avery, every smirk from Claire, drove the knife a little deeper. I kept folding towels, scrubbing counters, trying to prove I wasn't the enemy, but I could feel it, they were done with me. I'm Maggie Harper, and if you're still here, walking through these memories with me, you know how that house was starting to choke me. I'd spent years trying to be invisible, to keep the peace in a family that didn't want me. But after that call to the clinic, the masks came off. Lydia's anger wasn't just about money, it was about me, about everything I represented. I was the mother who'd given too much, the reminder of a past they wanted to bury, and now they were ready to bury me too. Those days after the letter arrived were like living in a house of mirrors. Every reflection distorted, every word a jab. I'd start my mornings the same way. Brewing Folgers coffee, the bitter smell mingling with the faint scent of damp leaves drifting through the screen door. The kitchen was quiet at dawn, the linoleum table scarred from years of use, the radio humming low with a local station playing old jazz. I'd move softly, wiping down the counters, folding the laundry Lydia left in the dryer, hoping my work would be enough to keep me safe. But it never was. Lydia was sharper now, her complaints less veiled. She'd sweep into the kitchen around noon, her heels clicking, her phone glued to her hand. "Maggie, you're always underfoot," she'd say, brushing past me to grab a yogurt from the fridge. "Can't you find something else to do?" I'd nod, mumble an apology, and retreat to my corner. But her words stung like a slap. I wanted to tell her I was trying to help, that I wasn't here to take anything from her. But I knew it wouldn't matter. To Lydia, I was a problem, and she was determined to solve me. Avery was worse. She'd always been prickly, but now her disdain was open, raw. One afternoon, I was making sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly, the kind Luke liked when she stormed in, her hair pulled back, her eyes narrowed. "Why are you even here?" she snapped, grabbing a soda from the fridge. "Like, seriously, Grandma, you're just making everything harder." I set the knife down, my hand steady despite the heat rising in my chest. "I'm just trying to help, Avery," I said, keeping my voice low. "I don't want to be a burden." She rolled her eyes, slamming the fridge door. "Then maybe you should go somewhere else. We don't need you messing things up more than you already have." She stomped out, her phone buzzing, leaving me with the half-made sandwich and a heart that felt like it was cracking. Claire was the spark that kept the fire burning. She didn't live with us, but she was there almost every day, lounging on the couch, sipping coffee from my mug, her gym water bottle always within reach. Her jabs were sly, wrapped in a smile that never reached her eyes. "Heard you caused a real government scare." "Maggie," she said one morning, flipping through a magazine at the kitchen table. "Bet you didn't think one call could do all that." I was sweeping the floor, the broom's soft scrape a steady rhythm. "I didn't mean any harm," I said, not looking up. "I was just answering their questions," she laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Yeah, well, intentions don't fix frozen bank accounts. You're lucky they even let you stay." I gripped the broom tighter, my knuckles white, but I didn't respond. I'd learned that fighting back only made things worse, that silence was my shield, but every word, every glance was another weight on my shoulders, and I was starting to buckle. Jim was the hardest part. My son. The boy I'd raised alone after his father passed, the one I'd worked nights for, was a stranger now. He'd come home late, his flannel shirt rumpled, his eyes avoiding mine. I'd try to catch him, to talk like we used to, but he'd brush me off, not now. "Mom," he'd say, grabbing a beer and sinking into the couch. I'd stand in the kitchen, watching the back of his head, and wonder where my boy had gone. Was he angry? Ashamed? Or had he just stopped caring? I think back now to 1990 when Jim was 18 and got his first job at the auto shop. He'd come home greasy and grinning, handing me a crumpled $10 bill. "For you, Mom," he'd said. Proud as anything, I'd tucked that bill into a jar, dreaming of the day we'd have a real home. a place where we'd always be welcome. That dream led me to Maple Street, to the house I helped buy, to the life I thought would last. But dreams don't always hold, and as I stood in that kitchen, scrubbing dishes while Lydia's voice carried from the dining room, I realized I'd been holding on to a ghost. Luke was my only light in those dark days. He was quiet, always tucked into his hoodie, but he'd linger sometimes, grabbing a glass of water or a Pop-Tart. One evening, as I was folding his t-shirts, he leaned against the doorway, earbuds dangling. "You don't have to do all this, Grandma," he said, his voice soft. I smiled, smoothing the fabric. "Keeps me busy." "Luke. Besides, someone's got to keep these clothes from turning into a pile." He didn't laugh, just looked at me with those big, serious eyes. "You're too good for this place," he said. Almost a whisper, then slipped away before I could respond. His words stayed with me, like a warm blanket on a cold night, but they couldn't drown out the growing storm. The hostility wasn't just in words. It was in the way they moved around me, like I was a piece of furniture they wished they could toss out. Lydia would leave dishes in the sink, knowing I'd wash them, then complain if a single spoon was out of place. Avery would blast her music, drowning out my radio, and smirk when I asked her to turn it down. Claire would sprawl on the couch, her feet on the coffee table, and talk loudly about how some people just don't know when to leave. I'd swallow the hurt, keep my head down, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. It kept slipping away. One night, I overheard them in the living room, their voices carrying through the thin walls. I was in my room, sorting through old photos, when Lydia's laugh rang out, sharp and mean. "She's like a ghost, haunting this place," she said. "We need to do something." Avery chimed in, her voice gleeful. "Why don't we just tell her to go, like, she's not even paying rent?" Claire's voice was lower, sly. "Make it her idea. Plant the seeds. Let her pack her own bags. Nobody has to feel bad that way." I sat frozen, a photo of Jim at his high school graduation in my hand, his smile so bright it hurt to look at. I wanted to storm out, to tell them I wasn't a ghost, that I was a mother, a grandmother, a person, but I didn't. I set the photo down, my hands trembling, and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The vent rattled, the washing machine thumped, and I felt like I was shrinking, dissolving into the shadows they'd made for me. I think back to my mother, to the way she'd sit at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and tell me stories of her own hard days. "People will try to make you small. Maggie," she'd say, "but you're bigger than their words. Don't ever forget that." I wanted to be that woman, the one who stood tall, but in that house, I felt like I was losing her, piece by piece. I kept going, day after day, folding laundry, brewing coffee, hoping for a miracle. I'd catch Luke's eye sometimes, see the worry in his face, and want to tell him I was okay. But I wasn't. The walls were closing in, and I could feel the storm coming, the one that would force me to choose stay and break, or walk away and find myself again. I didn't know how close that choice was, or how much it would hurt. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living as a shadow. Not for them, not for anyone. The night I left the house on Maple Street wasn't loud or dramatic, the way you might expect. There were no shattered plates, no final screams, no one grabbing my arm to beg me to stay. It was worse than that, quiet, cold and deliberate, like the family had already written me out of their story and was just waiting for me to catch up. I stood in the kitchen, the smell of Lydia's chicken dinner lingering in the air, and realized I wasn't welcome anymore. Not in their home, not in their lives. So I packed my bag, left the key on the table, and walked out into the autumn dark. My mother's handkerchief tucked in my pocket, like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I'm Maggie Harper, and if you've been with me through the weight of those days, you know how the walls of that house were closing in. I'd tried to be invisible. to hold the family together with coffee and clean counters. But after that phone call to the clinic, their anger had hardened into something sharper. Lydia's words, Avery's sneers, Claire's jabs, they'd made it clear I was the problem. And they wanted me gone. I could have fought, could have shouted, but I chose something harder. I chose to walk away, not because I was weak, but because I was done letting them make me small. That evening started like any other, with the soft glow of the kitchen light and the hum of the radio playing Ella Fitzgerald's My Funny Valentine. I was at the sink, washing dishes, the hot water stinging my hands as I scrubbed a pan crusted with grease. Lydia had made chicken for dinner, the kind with rosemary and lemon, but no one offered me a plate. I didn't ask. I'd eaten a slice of toast with peanut butter in my room, the TV on mute, just to have some noise that wasn't their laughter. I'd learned to live on the edges of their world, but that night, the edges felt sharper, like they were cutting me out. I stepped out to put my mug in the sink, the floor creaking under my slippers. Jim was on the couch, arms crossed, staring at the TV like it owed him something. The local news was on, a story about a factory closing in the next town over, but he wasn't watching it. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant. "Jim," I said, my voice soft, barely a whisper. "Can we talk for a second?" He didn't turn, didn't even blink. I said his name again, louder this time, but he just exhaled, a sharp sound through his nose, and kept his eyes on the screen. I stood there, the mug warm in my hands, and felt something break inside me, not loud, not violent, but slow, like a crack spreading across ice. Lydia walked out from the dining room, her silk blouse catching the light. She saw me and paused, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Still here," she said, her voice flat, like she was noting the weather. It wasn't a question, it was a dismissal. Claire chuckled from the table, where she was sipping wine and scrolling through her phone. "Yeah, Maggie. Don't you ever get tired of hovering," she said, not looking up. Avery came down the stairs, her sneakers thudding, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She glanced at me, her nose wrinkling like she'd smelled something sour. "Don't hover," she muttered, brushing past me to grab a soda from the fridge. That was the moment. Not because it was the cruelest thing they'd said, but because it was the last straw, the final layer of pretending peeled away. They weren't hiding it anymore. I wasn't their mother, their grandmother, their family. I was an inconvenience, a ghost they wished would vanish. I turned, my slippers silent on the linoleum, and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me without a sound. The room was small, barely more than a closet, with plastic bins stacked against the wall and a single bulb casting shadows. The vent above my bed rattled. The washing machine thumped in the next room, and I stood there, my heart pounding. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just started packing. My hands moving with a calm I didn't feel. 2 sweaters, a pair of jeans, my blood pressure pills, the photo of Jim at 6, grinning with a missing tooth. I tucked my mother's handkerchief into my pocket, its lace worn but soft, and zipped my old canvas bag. I checked the drawers twice, left the spare key on the dresser, and didn't write a note. They didn't deserve one. I think back now to 1975 when I was pregnant with Jim, sitting in my mother's kitchen with a cup of tea and a heart full of dreams. She'd looked at me, her hands rough from years of work, and said, "Maggie, you're going to be a mother, and that's the hardest job there is. But don't ever let anyone make you feel less than you are." I'd held on to those words through sleepless nights, through double shifts at the grocery store, through every sacrifice I made for Jim. But that night, as I packed my bag, I realized I'd let them do exactly that. I'd let Lydia, Avery, Claire, even Jim, make me feel like I was nothing. And I was done. I opened the door and saw Luke in the hallway, his hoodie up, a water bottle in his hand. His earbuds dangled around his neck, and his eyes widened when he saw the bag on my shoulder. "Grandma," he said, his voice small, like he was afraid to break the silence. "You're leaving?" I nodded, my throat tight. "I have to." "Luke," I said softly, "but I'll be okay. You take care of yourself. You hear?" He stepped forward, like he wanted to say more, but then stopped, his jaw tight. I wanted to hug him, to tell him I'd come back for him. But I didn't. I couldn't promise what I didn't know. I gave him a small smile, the kind my mother used to give me when things got tough, and walked past him. The hallway light flickered, casting long shadows, and I could hear Avery's laughter from her room, sharp and careless. The kitchen was empty now, the dishes still in the sink, the smell of chicken faint but lingering. Jim hadn't moved from the couch, his silhouette dark against the TV's glow. Lydia was gone, probably in her room, and Claire's wineglass sat abandoned on the table. I set my mug in the sink, the clink loud in the quiet, and walked to the front door. My hand paused on the knob, the wood cool under my fingers, and for a moment, I thought about turning back, about begging them to see me. But then I remembered my mother's voice, steady and sure. "Find another door, Maggie." I opened the door, and the autumn air rushed in, cold and crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. The porch light buzzed, casting a weak glow on the steps, and I stepped outside, my bag heavy on my shoulder. The door clicked shut behind me, a soft sound that felt final, like the end of a song. I didn't look back, I didn't slam it, I just started walking. The sidewalk cracked and uneven under my slippers, the stars above bright and unyielding. Willow Creek was quiet that night, the houses dark except for the occasional flicker of a TV. I passed the old oak at the corner, its branches swaying in the wind, and thought of the summers when I'd pushed Jim on a tire swing, his laughter ringing out. Those days were gone, but they lived in me, in the weight of the handkerchief in my pocket, in the stubborn hope that kept my feet moving. I didn't have a plan, no car, no place to go, but I had myself, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. I think back to that moment, to the cold air on my face, the stars watching me like old friends. I was scared, but I was free. I'd spent so long trying to be what they wanted, quiet, useful, invisible, that I'd forgotten who I was. But as I walked down Maple Street, the bag bouncing against my hip, I felt her coming back, the Maggie who'd raised a son alone, who'd worked until her hands bled, who'd never stopped believing in light beyond the storm. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I wasn't going back. I wasn't their shadow anymore. I was Maggie Harper, and I was choosing my own door, my own story. The road ahead was dark, but the stars were bright, and I told myself, "Keep walking, Maggie. There's light out there, and you'll find it." The first morning in my new place on Cedar Avenue, I woke to the sound of rain tapping the window, a soft rhythm that felt like a fresh start. The apartment was nothing much a single room behind glamour nails, with paper-thin walls and a lock that stuck every time I turned the key. But it was mine, and that made it feel like a palace. I lay on the creaky metal bed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked like a lopsided heart, and let myself breathe. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking up to the weight of someone else's anger. I was Maggie Harper, 62 years old, starting over. And though my heart was still bruised, I felt a flicker of something new hope, maybe, or just the quiet relief of being free. If you've been walking with me through the shadows of Maple Street, you know how hard it was to leave that house, to step into the cold with nothing but a bag and my mother's handkerchief. I thought I was losing everything, but standing in that tiny apartment, with the smell of wet pavement drifting through the cracked window, I realized I'd found something instead. Myself. I wasn't sure what came next, but when my phone started buzzing with calls from Lydia, telling me Luke was gone, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't done fighting. Not for him, not for the family we could still be. The apartment was on the edge of Willow Creek, a block of low brick buildings where the nail salon's neon sign flickered day and night. It wasn't much to look at: scuffed linoleum floors, a chipped dresser that leaned to the right, a nightstand with a drawer that stuck. I'd paid the first month's rent in cash, handing over the last of my savings to a landlord who didn't ask questions. My things were sparse: 2 sweaters, a pair of jeans, my blood pressure pills, and the photo of Jim at 6, tucked under my pillow. I'd taped a scrap of paper above the sink, scribbled with a single word: breathe. It was a reminder, a promise to myself that I wasn't in that house anymore, that I could build something new. I settled in slowly, finding comfort in small routines. I'd make instant oatmeal each morning, the steam rising from the bowl as I sat by the window, watching the world go by. Cedar Avenue was alive in its own way, mothers pushing strollers, delivery trucks rattling past, the chatter of nail techs spilling out when the salon door swung open. I'd turn on the tiny TV I'd bought for $10 at a thrift store, letting Jeopardy fill the quiet with Alex Trebek's familiar voice. It wasn't the life I dreamed of, but it was mine, and that was enough for now. The first few days were silent, and I was grateful. No calls, no texts, no fake smiles from Lydia or jabs from Claire. I'd expected to feel lonely, but instead, I felt light, like I'd shed a heavy coat I'd been carrying too long. I'd walk to the corner store, picking up bread and peanut butter, nodding to the cashier who always wore a Reds cap. I'd sit on the bed at night, knitting a scarf I didn't need, the click of the needles a steady rhythm. I told myself this was what I wanted: to disappear, to breathe, to be Maggie again. But silence has a way of turning cruel when it lingers. By the end of the first week, I found myself glancing at my phone, my thumb hovering over Luke's name in the contacts list. I'd start to type a message. "Hey, kid." "You okay?" Then delete it, afraid to drag him into my mess. He'd stayed out of the fight, hadn't thrown shoes or called me names, but he hadn't stopped them either. I didn't blame him. He was 17, caught in a house that chewed up anything soft. Still, I missed him. Missed his quiet smiles, the way he'd linger in the kitchen like he saw me when no one else did. I think back to 2008 when Luke was 5, and I'd take him to the park on Main Street. He'd cling to my hand, his sneakers kicking up dust, and point at the swings. "Push me. Grandma," he'd shout, his laugh bright enough to chase away the clouds. I'd push until my arms ached, watching him soar and think, this is what family is. Those moments were gone, but they lived in me. In the ache I felt when I thought of him now, I wondered if he was safe, if he was laughing somewhere, or if he was as lost as I'd been. The first call came on a Sunday morning, just as I was pouring tea into a chipped mug. The screen lit up with Jim's name, and my heart skipped. I stared at it, the phone buzzing like a trapped bee, then turned it face down. 5 minutes later, Lydia's name flashed, then Avery's, one after another. I didn't answer. I couldn't. An hour passed, and another call came. This time from a number I didn't know. 2 voicemails followed, but I didn't listen. Not yet. I wrapped my hands around the mug, the warmth grounding me, and told myself they weren't calling to apologize. They wanted something, and I wasn't ready to give it. That night, I turned the phone off and buried it under a towel, as if that could keep their voices out. But the next morning, it was worse. 10 missed calls, 3 voicemails, 2 texts from Jim. The first said, "We need to talk. It's about Luke." The second was just one word, "Please." That word stopped me cold. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone heavy in my lap, my heart thudding. Luke, my Luke. the boy who'd looked at me with red-rimmed eyes as I walked away. If something had happened to him, I'd never forgive myself. I forced myself to listen to one voicemail, my hands shaking as I pressed play. It was Avery's voice, but not the sharp, cruel one I knew. It was shaky, high, raw. "Grandma, please," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "He's missing. Luke's gone. We can't find him. Just call back if you hear anything." "Okay." The message cut off, and I sat there, frozen, replaying it in my head. Missing, gone. My mind spun picturing him on dark streets. Alone, cold. I hadn't reached out, hadn't checked on him, hadn't been there. Had I abandoned him, just like they'd abandoned me? I turned the phone off again, not out of anger, but because I couldn't breathe. The rain had stopped, and the apartment was quiet. The only sound, the drip of the faucet. I stood at the window, looking out at Cedar Avenue, the neon sign of glamour nails flickering like a heartbeat. I thought of Luke. His hoodie pulled up, his earbuds dangling, and felt a terrible certainty he hadn't just run away. Something had pushed him, something in that house, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the creaky bed, the water stain on the ceiling my only company, and let my mind wander to the worst places. Every creak of the building, every car horn outside, made me jolt, thinking it might be him. I clutched my mother's handkerchief, its lace a fragile anchor, and remembered her words. "You're stronger than you know." Maggie. I wanted to believe her, but all I could think about was Luke, out there somewhere, and the family that had driven us both away. By morning, the calls kept coming, 17 missed, 3 more voicemails, a handful of texts, all saying the same thing: he's missing. He left a note. We don't know where he is. I didn't trust them, not after everything, but I couldn't ignore it either. I called Willow Creek High School, my fingers trembling as I dialed. The secretary patched me through to Ms. Karen Walsh, the counselor who'd met me at a parent-teacher night years ago. Her voice was kind but careful when I asked about Luke. "He's been having a tough time at home," she said, pausing like she was choosing her words. "He told me he wished he could live with you." Maggie. My breath caught. "What happened?" I asked, gripping the phone. She lowered her voice. "Last week, he got into it with his sister. Avery told him he was weak for sticking up for you, said he should go live with his precious grandma if he loved you so much. She threw his stuff into the hall, and he left." The words hit like a punch. I felt heat rise in my neck, anger mixing with guilt. They'd lied in those voicemails, made it sound like Luke had vanished on his own. But the truth was uglier. They'd pushed him out, just like they'd pushed me, and now they wanted me to clean up their mess. I thanked Ms. Walsh, hung up, and sat on the bed, my hands clenched in my lap. Oh. The phone rang again. Lydia, then Claire, then Jim. I let them go to voicemail until Jim called a second time. I answered, my voice steady despite the storm inside. "Hello, Mom," he said, his voice cracking, like the boy who used to call me from gas stations when his car broke down. "He's gone. We're doing everything we can. The police say they'll file a report if he doesn't come back tonight." "What happened?" Jim, I asked, calm but cold. "We don't know," he said. "Too quick. He didn't take his phone. We thought maybe he came to you." "Why would he do that?" I asked, letting the question hang. A pause. Then, "Because you're the only one he still talks about like he trusts." That landed, heavy and sharp. I didn't tell him what Ms. Walsh said. Didn't tell him I knew Avery's cruelty. Lydia's silence. Claire's laughter had driven Luke away. I just said, "If I hear from him, I'll let you know." Then I hung up. My heart pounding, my mind made up. If Luke came to me, I wasn't sending him back. I sat there, gripping the edge of the bed, and thought of my mother's kitchen, the way she'd hum along to the radio. her hands kneading dough. When things get dark, Maggie, look for the light. I didn't know where Luke was, but I knew I'd be his light, no matter what it took. This apartment, this new life, wasn't just for me anymore. It was for him. For the family we could still build. The story of me and Luke isn't over, and I hope you'll keep walking with us as we find our way. If this moment touched you, please hit that subscribe button and share in the comments. Who's been your light when the world felt dark? Your story might just help someone else find theirs. The moment I saw Luke sitting on those concrete steps, his hoodie pulled up against the drizzle, I felt my heart stitch itself back together. It was late afternoon in Willow Creek, Ohio, the sky a heavy grey that matched the weight I'd been carrying. I'd taken a bus across town, my old canvas bag slung over my shoulder, every rattle and squeak of the ride stretching my nerves thin. When I stepped onto the cracked sidewalk of that unfamiliar street, there he was, my grandson, 17 and lost, but alive, his duffel bag at his feet like a lifeline. He stood when he saw me, his eyes wide, and before I could say a word, he hugged me. A real hug. The kind that says you're the only safe place left. In that moment, under the fading light, I knew I'd found more than Luke. I'd found home. I'm Maggie Harper, and if you've been with me through the cold nights and the quiet of my new apartment on Cedar Avenue, you know how much I was holding on to hope for Luke. That house on Maple Street had broken us both, but standing there, with his arms around me, I felt something stronger than their cruelty love, the kind that doesn't need words. When Luke told me why he'd left, how they'd pushed him out just like they'd pushed me, I made a promise to myself I wasn't letting him go back. This was our chance to build something new, something real, and I was ready to fight for it. The call had come just past noon, from an unknown number that barely rang before cutting off. I'd stared at my phone, my tea gone cold on the nightstand, and hit redial with a trembling hand, expecting a scam or silence, but a young voice answered, hesitant, unfamiliar. "Hello, this is Maggie Harper," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "I'm looking for Luke." A pause, then a deep breath. "Yeah, hang on." I heard muffled movement, a door creaking, and then his voice, small and shaky, like he hadn't spoken in hours. "Grandma Luke." I breathed, my knees buckling. I sank onto the bed, gripping the phone. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm safe," he said quickly. "I'm with Malik, a friend from school. He let me crash at his place. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't go to school today. Didn't want them calling home." "Are you hurt?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Do you need anything?" "No," he said, then paused. "Can I come to you?" The question broke something in me, a dam I'd been holding back since I left Maple Street. "Of course, Luke," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "Anytime, right now. Just tell me where." He texted me the address, a street a few neighborhoods over, not far, but a world away from the life we'd known. I grabbed my coat, my bag, and the last of my cash, locking the apartment door behind me. The bus ride was agonizing, every stop a test of my patience, every loud noise making me check my phone to ensure he hadn't changed his mind. Willow Creek unfolded outside the window, faded storefronts, leafless oaks, kids on bikes dodging puddles. I clutched my mother's handkerchief, its lace worn but steady, and thought of her words, "When someone needs you, Maggie, you show up." I was showing up now, for Luke, for myself. Malik's house was a small bungalow with peeling blue paint and a sagging porch. Luke sat on the steps, his duffel bag stuffed with clothes, his hoodie soaked from the drizzle. He stood when he saw me, his face pale but relieved. And before I could speak, he was in my arms, his head against my shoulder. I held him tight, feeling the tremble in his frame. the weight of everything he'd carried. "I've got you," I whispered, my voice thick. "You're safe now." We didn't talk much on the bus ride back. Luke kept his hood up, earbuds in, staring out the window as the town blurred by. I didn't push. I knew he needed time, just like I had when I first stepped into that apartment. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shiny, the neon sign of glamour nails glowing as we reached Cedar Avenue. I unlocked the sticky door, and we stepped inside, the air warm and faintly sweet from the oatmeal I'd made that morning. Luke looked around, his eyes taking in the sparse room, the metal bed, the chipped dresser, the TV flickering with a Jeopardy rerun. "It's small," he said, setting his bag down, "but it feels better, quieter." I smiled, setting my bag on the nightstand. "It's not much, but it's ours." "You hungry?" He nodded, and I made tea, the kettle hissing as I sliced bread for peanut butter sandwiches. We sat on the bed, the only place to sit, and ate in silence, the TV's soft buzz filling the gaps. I watched him, the way he chewed slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. I wanted to ask what had happened, to hear it from him, but I waited. He'd tell me when he was ready. It came later, after he'd unpacked his bag, folding his clothes into the bottom drawer of the dresser. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his hoodie off, his hair messy. "They lied, didn't they?" he said, his voice low, like he was testing the words. "They said I ran away, but they kicked me out." I sat on the bed, my hands clasped, and nodded. "I talked to Ms. Walsh at school," I said. "She told me about Avery. What she said to you." His jaw tightened, his eyes dropping to the floor. "She called me a traitor," he said, his voice tight. "Said I was pathetic for defending you. She told me to go live with you if I loved you so much, then opened my door and threw my stuff into the hall. Mom didn't stop her." Claire laughed. "Dad just told me to let it go, said I was being dramatic." I closed my eyes, anger and grief twisting in my chest. I pictured Luke, his room a sanctuary of band posters and art supplies, violated by Avery's cruelty, Lydia's silence, Jim's indifference. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said softly. "They didn't like that you saw them for who they are." He looked up, his eyes glistening. "I didn't want you to leave," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know how. I slid off the bed, kneeling beside him, my knees creaking. "I know, Luke," I said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to explain. You're here now, and that's what matters." He nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "Can I stay?" he asked, his voice small, like he was afraid I'd say no, always. I said, my voice firm, "This is your home too." He smiled, just a little, and went back to unpacking, pulling out a sketchbook and a few pencils. I watched him, my heart full and aching, and thought of my mother, how she'd always kept a spare bed made up for anyone who needed it. "Family isn't blood. Maggie," she'd say, "it's who shows up." Luke had shown up, and so had I. That night, he slept on a pile of blankets on the floor, too tired to care about the lack of a second bed. I lay awake, listening to his steady breathing, the rain starting up again outside. The apartment was small, the walls thin enough to hear the nail techs laughing next door, but it felt like a fortress, a place where we could be us. I thought of Maple Street, of the house that had tried to break us, and felt a quiet strength. We weren't there anymore. We were here, together, and that was enough. I think back to 2010 when Luke was 7, and we'd fixed a bike in the garage on Maple Street. He'd handed me tools, his small hands steady, his eyes bright with pride when the chain clicked into place. "We did it." Grandma, he'd said, his grin wide enough to light up the world. That boy was still here, buried under the hurt, and I was determined to help him find that light again. The next morning, I made oatmeal, the steam rising as I set 2 bowls on the nightstand. Luke was already up, sketching in his book, a pencil moving across the page. He looked up, his hair falling into his eyes, and gave me a small smile. "This already feels better," he said, his voice soft but sure. I handed him a bowl, my heart swelling. "It's just the start. Luke," I said, "we'll figure it out together." He nodded, taking a bite, and I saw something in his eyes, hope. Maybe, or just the relief of being seen. We ate in silence, the TV flickering with the morning talk show, the rain a gentle patter outside. The apartment was small, but it was ours, filled with the promise of new beginnings. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing: Luke was here, and I wasn't letting him go. As we sat there, I thought of my mother's kitchen, the smell of her oatmeal cookies, the way she'd hum along to the radio. "When you find your people, Maggie, hold them close." I was holding Luke close now, and no matter what came next, I'd fight to keep him safe. Our story was just beginning, and I hoped we'd find the light together. The knock on my apartment door came sharp and fast, like someone who didn't plan to wait for an answer. It was 2 days after Luke had come to stay. A grey afternoon in Willow Creek, Ohio, with the air heavy from a morning rain. I was in the tiny kitchen, stirring oatmeal, the steam curling up like a quiet promise, when the sound jolted me. I knew who it was before I even peeked through the peephole. Lydia, in her beige trench coat, looking like she'd stepped out of a catalogue, and Jim, my son, staring at his boots like a kid caught in trouble. My heart thudded, but I didn't open the door right away. I let them knock again, let them stand in the damp hallway outside Glamour Nails, until I was ready. This was my home now, and I wasn't letting them take it or Luke away. I'm Maggie Harper, and if you've been with me through the long road from Maple Street to this little apartment on Cedar Avenue, you know how far I've come. Leaving that house was one thing, but finding Luke, bringing him here, was another. He was my light, my reason to keep going. And when Lydia and Jim showed up, I knew they weren't here to apologize. They wanted Luke back, not because they loved him, but because they needed to save face. I wasn't the same Maggie who'd folded their towels and bitten her tongue. I was ready to fight, not with shouts, but with the quiet strength I'd found in myself. I cracked the door open, stepping halfway into the frame, my hand steady on the knob. Lydia's eyes darted past me, searching the apartment. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Jim shuffled behind her, his flannel jacket damp, his hands stuffed in his pockets. The air smelled of rain and nail polish from the salon next door, and the neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a pink glow on their faces. "We just want to talk," Lydia said quickly, her voice smooth but tight, like she'd rehearsed it. "This isn't a fight, Maggie." Jim nodded, still not looking up. "Yeah, Mom. We're worried about Luke." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my voice calm. "Worried about Luke? Or worried about how this looks?" I asked, letting the words hang. Lydia's smile faltered, but she recovered fast, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Can we come in?" she asked, her tone softer now, almost pleading. I hesitated, glancing back at the apartment. Luke was in the bathroom, the faint sound of the faucet running, and I didn't want him walking into this unprepared. But I stepped aside, opening the door wider, and they walked in, moving to the small kitchen table like it was a boardroom. Lydia sat, crossing her legs, her coat draped over the chair. Jim stood, leaning against the counter, his eyes flicking to the chipped dresser, the TV flickering with the Jeopardy rerun. The room felt smaller with them in it, the air thicker, like the past had followed them through the door. I stayed standing, my hands clasped, the weight of my mother's handkerchief in my pocket grounding me. "So," I said, my voice even. What's this about? Lydia leaned forward, her hands folded on the table, her nails polished and perfect. We're here because we're worried. She began, her voice measured, about Luke, about how all this looks, the school, the neighbors, child services, they're asking questions. He's 17, Maggie, people talk. I tilted my head, studying her. And whose idea was it to throw his things into the hallway, I asked, keeping my tone calm but sharp. Her mouth twitched, the first crack in her composure. Jim shifted, his boots scuffing the linoleum. But he didn't speak. Lydia straightened, her smile returning, though it was tighter now. He was acting out, she said, her voice clipped. He called us abusive, Maggie, in front of everyone. You know how that sounds. Sounds like he was telling the truth. I said, my eyes steady on hers. He was scared. Lydia, you didn't like that he called you out. Her jaw tightened. And for a moment, I saw the real her, not the polished woman in the trench coat, but the one who'd let her daughter bully her son, who'd watched me walk away without a word. You don't know what it's like, she snapped, her voice rising just a fraction. Raising 2 kids, managing bills, dealing with a sister who's always around. And a mother-in-law who what I cut in, my voice still calm but firm, who helped pay for your house, who folded your laundry and kept quiet while you made her feel like nothing. The room went quiet, the only sound the faint buzz of the TV and the drip of the faucet. Jim looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time, and I saw something flicker there, guilt, maybe, or shame, but he didn't speak, and that silence was louder than any words. Lydia leaned back, her hand smoothing her coat. You're twisting this, she said, her voice low again. We're trying to do what's best for Luke. I stepped closer, my hands unclenching. Best for Luke, or best for you, I asked. I've got his texts. Lydia, Avery's posts on Instagram, laughing about pushing the parasite out. Ms. Walsh at school, telling me how you let Avery throw his stuff out. You don't get to come here and pretend this is about his well-being. This is about damage control. Her face paled, her fingers tightening on the table. Jim cleared his throat, finally speaking. Is he okay? He asked, his voice rough. He hasn't answered our calls. He's safe, I said, my eyes flicking to him. And no, he doesn't want to go back. He made that clear. Lydia scoffed, tossing her hair. He's a child. Maggie. He doesn't get to decide everything. He's 17, I said, my voice steady. Old enough to know when he's being manipulated. Old enough to know who shows up when things get bad. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. So what, you think you can just keep him? You live in a shoebox. Maggie, you can't even afford this place. Better a shoebox full of peace than a house full of poison. I said, the words coming out stronger than I'd expected. I felt a fire in my chest, not anger, but something fiercer certainty. I wasn't backing down. Not this time. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said. Lydia looked at Jim, then back at me, her mouth opening like she wanted to argue, but no words came. Jim rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes dropping again. So, what do you want? He asked, his voice low. You're just going to keep him, like that? Yes, I said. No hesitation. Unless he tells me otherwise. Lydia's voice rose, sharp and brittle. You don't have custody. Maggie. You don't have rights. We're trying to be civil here. I walked to the door, my hand on the knob, and opened it, the cool air rushing in. If you were trying to be civil, I said, you wouldn't have waited until your lie started unraveling to show up. Luke's not your shield. He's not your cleanup crew. He's a kid you broke because he dared to care about someone you decided didn't matter. They didn't move at first, their faces a mix of shock and defiance. Lydia stood slowly, grabbing her coat, her eyes blazing. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low. "Maybe not," I said, holding her gaze. "But if Luke wants to talk to you, he'll let you know. Until then, don't come back." Jim followed her, pausing at the door. He looked at me, his mouth opening like he wanted to say something, then closed it and walked out. I locked the door behind them, the click loud in the quiet, and leaned against it, my heart racing. I'd done it. I'd stood my ground, not with shouts or tears, but with the truth, and it felt like coming alive. Luke came out of the bathroom a moment later, his hair wet, a towel around his neck. He looked at me, his eyes searching. "Was that them?" he asked. His voice soft. I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah," I said. "They wanted to talk about you." He didn't ask what they said, just stood there, his hands in his pockets. "Did you tell them?" he asked. "Everything they needed to hear," I said, giving him a small smile. He nodded, his shoulders relaxing, and went back to brushing his teeth. I watched him, my heart full, and thought of my mother, how she'd stood up to her own family when they tried to pull her down. You're bigger than their words. Maggie. I'd been smaller for too long, but not anymore. Luke and I were building something new, something ours, and no one could take that away. I think back to 1987 when Jim was 15, and we'd fought over his curfew. He'd stormed out, but came back an hour later, slipping a note under my door. "Sorry, Mom. I love you." I'd kept that note, tucked in a box somewhere. And though he hadn't written one this time, I saw that boy in his eyes today. The one who wanted to make things right but didn't know how. I wasn't sure if I could forgive him, but I knew I still loved him, and that was enough for now. That night, Luke and I sat on the bed, eating peanut butter sandwiches and watching a rerun of Wheel of Fortune. The apartment was small, the walls thin, but it was warm, filled with the sound of our quiet laughter. I looked at him, his pencil moving across his sketchbook, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. We weren't just surviving, we were living, and that was a victory they couldn't touch. The morning I walked into the Franklin County Legal Aid Center, I felt like I was carrying the weight of every hard day I'd ever lived. My old canvas bag was slung over my shoulder, stuffed with papers, texts from Avery, voicemails from Lydia, a letter from Luke's school counselor, Ms. Walsh. The air in Willow Creek was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that makes your breath catch, and I stood outside the brick building for a moment, clutching my mother's handkerchief. I wasn't just fighting for Luke. I was fighting for the life we were building, the one we'd carved out in that tiny apartment on Cedar Avenue. I was Maggie Harper, 62 years old, and I was done letting anyone take what mattered most. If you've been with me through the long road from Maple Street, through the quiet nights and the fierce stand I took against Lydia and Jim, you know how much Luke means to me. He's my light, the boy who saw me when no one else did, and when I learned they'd pushed him out just like they'd pushed me, I knew I had to protect him. The law wasn't something I understood, not really, but I'd learned a thing or two about standing up for what's right. As I stepped through those glass doors, I felt my mother's voice in my ear. "You're stronger than you know, Maggie." I was ready to prove it. The Legal Aid Center was a plain space, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and rows of plastic chairs that creaked when you sat. The air smelled of stale coffee and photocopy ink, and a receptionist with a kind smile pointed me to a waiting area. I sat, my bag in my lap, watching people come and go, mothers with tired eyes. An old man with a cane, a young couple whispering nervously. I felt out of place, like a kid in a principal's office, but I straightened my shoulders and reminded myself why I was there. Luke was back at the apartment, doing his schoolwork at our wobbly kitchen table, and I wasn't going to let him down. After nearly an hour, a woman called my name. Ms. Diane Perry was mid-40s, with short brown hair and glasses that slipped down her nose. She led me to a small office, its walls lined with file cabinets. A single window letting in grey light. She sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and a mug that said "World's Okayest Lawyer," and gestured for me to sit. "So, Maggie," she said, her voice warm but businesslike. "Tell me about Luke." I took a deep breath, my hands clasped around my bag, and started from the beginning. I told her about Maple Street, about the phone call that turned the family against me, about how they'd thrown me out and then done the same to Luke. I showed her the evidence I'd gathered, screenshots of Avery's Instagram posts. One captioned, "Finally pushed the parasite out." Voicemails from Lydia demanding Luke's return. Texts from Jim that swung between guilt and blame. I told her about Miss Walsh, who'd confirmed Luke didn't feel safe at home, and about the night he showed up on Malik's steps. His hoodie soaked, his heart broken. Miss Perry listened, her pen moving across a legal pad, her face calm but focused. When I finished, she pushed her glasses up and leaned back. "You've got a strong case for emergency temporary custody," she said, tapping the papers I'd brought. The texts, the counselor's statement, the voicemails, they show a pattern of emotional neglect, maybe even abandonment. But you're not his legal guardian. Maggie, the judge will want to know why you're the best option. I nodded, my throat tight. Luke needs a place where he's seen, I said, my voice steady. Where he's loved, not pushed aside. I may not have much, just a small apartment and a little savings, but I've got enough love to give him that. She smiled, just a little, and scribbled something down. "That's a good start," she said. "We'll file the petition today, but you need to be ready. The family might fight back, and the judge will ask hard questions. Can you handle that? I've handled harder." I said, thinking of the nights I'd worked double shifts, the years I'd raised Jim alone, the moment I'd walked away from Maple Street. "I'm not afraid." She nodded, handing me a stack of forms. "Good. Let's get to work." I left the office with a folder of paperwork and a spark of hope, my steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. The sky had cleared, the sun breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. I walked past the corner store, waving at the cashier in the Red's cap, and thought of Luke, his sketchbook open on the table, his pencil moving in quiet strokes. He was why I was doing this, why I'd sat in that plastic chair, why I'd faced my fears. He deserved a home, and I was going to give him one. Back at the apartment, Luke was where I'd left him, hunched over his homework, a plate of toast crumbs beside him. The TV was on low, a Wheel of Fortune rerun, and the air smelled of peanut butter and rain. He looked up when I came in, his hair falling into his eyes. "How'd it go?" he asked, his voice soft, like he was afraid of the answer. I set my bag down, giving him a small smile. "It went okay," I said, sitting on the bed. "I met with a lawyer, Miss Perry. We're filing for custody, temporary for now, so you can stay here." His eyes widened, a mix of relief and worry. "You don't have to fight them," he said, setting his pencil down. "I'm not going back there, no matter what." I leaned forward, my hands clasped. "I'm not fighting them for their sake. Luke," I said, "I'm doing this so no one can take you away from where you're safe. This is our home now, and I'm making sure it stays that way." He nodded, his shoulders relaxing, and picked up his pencil again. "Thanks, Grandma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." I smiled, my heart full, and started unpacking the forms, spreading them across the nightstand. The apartment was small, the walls thin enough to hear the nail tech's laughter next door, but it felt like a fortress, a place where we could rebuild. I thought of my mother, how she'd kept a ledger of every penny, planning for the future even when it seemed impossible. "You make a way, Maggie," she'd say. I was making a way now, one step at a time. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and waiting. I'd sit at the library, using their computers to research custody laws, my glasses slipping as I squinted at the screen. I'd call Ms. Perry with questions, my voice steady despite the nerves. At home, Luke was settling in, his sketches piling up on the dresser, his laughter coming easier. One evening, he showed me a drawing, a small apartment with light streaming through a window. 2 chairs at a table. It was our place, down to the chipped dresser, and I felt tears prick my eyes. That's beautiful. Luke, I said, tracing the lines with my finger. You've got a real gift. He shrugged, but his smile was shy, proud, just wanted to make it ours, he said. I kept that drawing close, tucking it under my pillow next to Jim's old photo. It was a reminder of what we were building, of why I was fighting. But the fight wasn't just against Lydia and Jim. It was against the fear in my own heart, the voice that whispered I wasn't enough. That a 62-year-old woman in a shoebox apartment couldn't be what Luke needed. I pushed that voice down, remembering my mother's hands kneading dough. Her voice steady. You're enough, Maggie, always have been. I think back to 1982 when Jim was 10, and I'd taken him to the county fair in Willow Creek. He'd won a stuffed bear at a ring toss, handing it to me with a grin. For you, Mom, he'd said, his eyes bright. I'd kept that bear for years, until it was lost in a move. But the memory stayed, a reminder of the boy who'd loved me fiercely. I saw that boy in Jim's eyes when he'd stood in my apartment, asking about Luke. But I also saw the man who'd let me walk away. I wasn't sure if he'd fight for Luke, or if Lydia would, but I was ready either way. One night, as I was knitting on the bed, Luke asleep on his pile of blankets, my phone buzzed with a text from Jim Mom. You okay? I stared at it, my heart twisting. I didn't reply. But I kept the message, a small crack in the wall between us. Then, a day later, Claire dropped off my mother's handkerchief at the salon, left with a note. Found this. I held it, the lace soft against my fingers, and wondered if it was Lydia's way of saying something she couldn't voice. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start, a sign she was waking up to what she'd lost. I kept moving forward, filling out forms, calling Miss Perry, cleaning the apartment until it shone. Luke started sleeping better, his sketches brighter, his voice steadier. We'd eat oatmeal and laugh over Jeopardy answers. The TV's glow warming the room. The hearing was coming, and though I was scared, I felt a strength I hadn't known I had. I wasn't just fighting for Luke, I was fighting for the Maggie I'd almost lost. The one who'd raised a son, survived a storm, and found light in the smallest places. As I sat in that apartment, the neon sign flickering outside, I thought of my mother's kitchen, the smell of her coffee, the way she'd smile when I walked in. You make a way, Maggie. I was making a way now, for Luke, for us, and no matter what the judge said, I knew we'd be okay. We'd found each other, and that was a victory no one could take. The courtroom in Willow Creek wasn't like the ones you see on TV, no polished wood, no dramatic gavel banging, just a plain room with scuffed linoleum and rows of mismatched chairs. I sat there, my hands clasped around my mother's handkerchief, the lace worn but steady, feeling the weight of every step that had brought me here. Luke was beside me, his hoodie swapped for a borrowed button-up shirt, his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. Across the aisle, Lydia sat stiffly, her beige trench coat draped over her lap, her face a mask of control. The air smelled of dust and old coffee, and the morning light slanted through a high window, catching motes in the air. I wasn't sure what the judge would say, but as I looked at Luke, I knew one thing: I'd fought for him, and that was enough. I'm Maggie Harper, and if you've walked with me from the shadows of Maple Street to the small apartment on Cedar Avenue, you know this moment was more than a hearing. It was the end of one storm and the start of something new. Luke was my light, the boy who'd chosen me when no one else did. And I'd poured everything into keeping him safe, every scrap of evidence, every sleepless night, every prayer whispered over a cup of Folgers. As I sat in that courtroom, waiting for the judge's decision, I felt my mother's voice in my heart. "You're bigger than their words." Maggie, I was ready to see this through. Not for revenge, but for love. The days leading up to the hearing had been a blur of nerves and preparation. I'd spent hours with Ms. Diane Perry, the lawyer from the Franklin County Legal Aid Center, going over my statement, organizing evidence texts from Avery, voicemails from Lydia, the letter from Ms. Walsh confirming Luke's fear of returning home. I'd stayed up late, knitting in the glow of the TV, Jeopardy reruns a soft comfort as I rehearsed answers in my head. Luke had been quiet, sketching more than talking, but he'd written a letter for the judge, his words careful and raw. "I want to stay with my grandma." He'd written, "She's the only one who makes me feel safe." I hadn't read it, but Ms. Perry said it was powerful, and I trusted him to speak his truth. The morning of the hearing, I'd woken early, the apartment still dark, the neon sign of Glamour Nails flickering outside. I'd made oatmeal, the steam rising as I set 2 bowls on the nightstand and watched Luke eat, his hair falling into his eyes. "You nervous?" I'd asked, my voice soft. He'd shrugged, picking at his food. "A little," he said. But I meant what I wrote. "I'm not going back." I'd reached across, squeezing his hand. "I'm proud of you." "Luke," I'd said, "no matter what happens today, we're in this together." He'd nodded, a small smile breaking through, and I'd felt a warmth in my chest, like the sun coming out after a long rain. We'd dressed carefully, me in my best sweater, him in a shirt borrowed from Malik's dad, and walked to the courthouse, the autumn air crisp, the oaks along Main Street shedding their last leaves. Willow Creek felt different that day, less like a place that had hurt us and more like a town we could call home. Inside the courtroom, the hearing was quiet, almost ordinary. The judge, a woman in her 50s with grey hair pulled into a bun, sat at a raised desk, her glasses perched on her nose. Ms. Perry stood beside me, her briefcase open, papers neatly stacked. Lydia's lawyer, a young man in a cheap suit, fidgeted with his tie, his voice thin as he argued their side. "My client believes Luke needs stability," he said, gesturing to Lydia. "A family home, his parents, his sister. This is what's best for a minor." Ms. Perry didn't flinch. She presented our case with calm precision, laying out the evidence like pieces of a puzzle. She showed the judge Avery's Instagram post, the one mocking me as a parasite, and played Lydia's voicemail. Her voice sharp, "Maggie, you need to tell us where he is." She read Miss Walsh's letter, detailing Luke's fear of returning home, and handed over Luke's own letter, sealed in an envelope. I watched the judge's face, searching for a sign, but her expression stayed neutral, her pen moving across a notepad. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, my knees trembling, but my voice steady. The room was silent, the only sound the creak of a chair and the faint hum of a heater. "Your Honor," I said, my hands clasped, "I'm not here to take Luke from his family. I'm here because he chose me, because he needs a place where he's loved, not pushed away. I don't have a big house or a lot of money, but I have a home, and I have love. I've raised a son alone, worked hard all my life, and I'll do whatever it takes to give Luke what he needs." The judge nodded, her eyes kind but unreadable, and asked me to sit. Lydia's lawyer called her to speak, and she stood, her posture perfect, her voice smooth. "I love my son," she said, her hands folded. "We made mistakes, but we're his parents. He belongs with us, in a stable home, not with someone who can't provide for him." I felt Luke tense beside me, his fingers curling into fists. I reached for his hand under the table, squeezing gently, and he relaxed, just a little. I wanted to stand again, to tell the judge about the hallway, the thrown clothes, the laughter. But I trusted Miss Perry. She'd warned me to stay calm, to let the evidence speak, and I did. The judge took a long moment, reading through the papers, her glasses slipping down her nose. She looked at me, then at Luke, then at Lydia, and I held my breath, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape. Finally, she spoke, her voice clear and steady. Based on the evidence, she said, I find sufficient cause to grant emergency temporary custody to Margaret Harper. Luke will remain in her care pending further review. The court will schedule a follow-up in 6 months. The words hit me like a wave. Relief so sharp it stole my breath. Luke's hand tightened in mine, and I felt tears prick my eyes. But I didn't let them fall. Miss Perry gave me a small nod, her smile quiet but proud. Lydia sat frozen, her hands gripping her coat, her face pale. Her lawyer whispered something, but she didn't respond, just stared straight ahead, like she was seeing something far away. We stood to leave, the room emptying slowly, the creak of chairs and shuffle of feet filling the silence. Lydia didn't look at me as she walked out, her heels clicking on the linoleum. But I saw her hands tremble. Just for a moment, I wondered if she was waking up, if she saw what she'd lost. But I didn't dwell on it. My focus was Luke, his hand still in mine, his steps lighter as we walked into the hallway. Outside, the sun was high, the air cool and clean, the oaks along Main Street glowing gold in the light. We didn't speak, didn't need to. I felt like I was holding Luke's hand the way I had when he was 5, leading him through a park, promising him the world. We stopped at the corner, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a bakery nearby, and he looked at me, his eyes bright. We did it. Grandma, he said, his voice soft but sure. We did, I said, smiling, my heart full. We're a team, you and me. We took the bus back to Cedar Avenue, the ride quiet, the town unfolding outside the window, kids on bikes, pumpkins on porches, life going on. Back at the apartment, I made mac and cheese, the real kind with butter and cheddar, not the powdered stuff. We ate on the floor, the TV off, the only sound the clink of our forks and the faint laughter from the nail salon. It wasn't a feast, but it was ours, and it felt like a celebration. I think back to 1978, when Jim was 5, and I'd carried him home through a blizzard, promising I'd always keep him safe. I hadn't been able to keep that promise, not the way I'd hoped, but with Luke, I was getting a second chance. I saw Jim in him sometimes, in the way he tilted his head, the quiet strength in his eyes, and though Jim hadn't come to the hearing, I held on to a small hope that he'd find his way back too. That night, as Luke sketched and I knitted, I thought of my mother's kitchen, the smell of her oatmeal cookies, the way she'd hum along to Ella Fitzgerald. You make a way, Maggie, she'd say. I'd made a way, not just for Luke, but for myself. I'd walked through a storm and found light, not because I was fearless, but because I was stubborn, because I loved, because I believed in something bigger than their words. I looked at Luke, his pencil moving across the page, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. We weren't done. Fighting temporary custody was just a step, but we were together. And that was a victory no one could take. I'd found my people, and I was holding them close, just like my mother taught me. The morning sun slipped through the cracked blinds of our apartment on Cedar Avenue, painting golden stripes across the linoleum floor. I stood at the stove, stirring oatmeal, the steam rising with a faint sweetness that filled the small space. Luke was sprawled on the bed, his sketchbook open, a pencil scratching softly as he drew. The TV hummed low, a Jeopardy rerun. Alex Trebek's voice a familiar comfort in the quiet. It had been 2 weeks since the courthouse. Since the judge's words, temporary custody granted, had lifted a weight I'd carried too long. This apartment, with its chipped dresser and buzzing neon sign from glamour nails outside, wasn't just a place to live anymore. It was home, ours, built from love and stubborn hope, and every day with Luke felt like a step toward healing. I'm Maggie Harper, and if you've walked with me from the cold nights of Maple Street to the courtroom's quiet victory, you know this journey hasn't been easy. Leaving that house, finding Luke, fighting for him, it was a storm I hadn't known I could weather. But here we were, in a shoebox apartment in Willow Creek, Ohio, laughing over burnt toast and building something real. When Jim's text came, or when Claire dropped off my handkerchief, I saw glimmers of regret from the family that had pushed us out. But I wasn't looking back. Luke and I were looking forward, stitching our hearts back together. And that was more than enough. Our days had settled into a rhythm, simple but steady. I'd wake early, the rain or wind tapping the window, and make coffee. The Folgers can a familiar weight in my hands. Luke would stumble out of his pile of blankets on the floor, rubbing his eyes, and we'd eat breakfast oatmeal or peanut butter sandwiches, sometimes with a side of his quiet jokes. He'd head to school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and I'd clean the apartment, knitting or reading by the window until he came back. The space was small, the walls thin enough to hear the nail techs chatter next door, but it was warm, filled with the smell of bread and the soft glow of our life together. Luke was changing, blooming in ways I hadn't expected. He'd joined the art club at Willow Creek High, coming home with stories about paint smudges and charcoal sketches. One afternoon, he burst through the door, his hoodie dusted with pencil shavings, and held up a drawing, a street scene, Cedar Avenue with its neon signs and leafless oaks, alive with color. "Got an A," he said, his grin shy but proud. "That's amazing." "Luke," I said, tracing the lines with my finger, "you've got a real gift. You know that." He shrugged, but his eyes lit up. "Just messing around," he said, tucking the drawing into a folder. "But it's cool, I guess." I pinned that drawing to the wall, next to a grocery list and a photo of us at the park, Luke's arm slung around my shoulder. The apartment was starting to look like ours. Not just a place to sleep, but a home with roots. I'd bought a second-hand table for $5, wobbly but sturdy enough for our meals. And Luke had added his touch, a stack of sketchbooks, a mug filled with pencils, a Green Day poster taped above the dresser. Every small change felt like a victory, a reclaiming of the life we'd almost lost. But healing wasn't just about drawings or new furniture. It was in the quiet moments, the ones that snuck up on you. One evening, as we ate mac and cheese on the floor, the TV off, Luke looked at me and said, "You ever think about going back? Not to live, just to talk." I set my fork down, the question catching me off guard. The neon sign buzzed outside, casting a pink glow through the blinds. "I left because I had to." "Luke," I said, my voice soft, not just because they pushed me out, but because I realized they'd never stop trying to make me feel like I didn't matter. "I don't need to talk to them to know who I am now." He nodded, his eyes on his plate. "I don't want to go back either," he said. "But sometimes I wonder if Dad misses me." I reached across, touching his hand. "He does, in his way." I said, "That text he sent, asking if I'm okay, it's small, but it's something. People take time to see their mistakes. Luke, doesn't mean you have to wait for them." He smiled, just a little, and passed me the last piece of bread. "You're pretty smart, Grandma," he said, his voice teasing. I laughed. The sound warm in the small room. "Took me 62 years to get here," I said. "You're catching up quick. Those moments were our glue, binding us closer, but the past wasn't gone. Jim's text, "Mom, you okay?" sat unanswered in my phone, a weight I wasn't ready to lift. Claire's delivery of my handkerchief, left at the salon with a scribbled note, felt like a gesture from Lydia. But it wasn't enough to bridge the gap. I didn't hate them, not anymore. I'd let go of the anger somewhere between Maple Street and Cedar Avenue, but forgiveness was a slow road, and I was still walking it. I kept the handkerchief in my pocket, the lace a reminder of my mother's strength, and focused on Luke, on us. I think back to 1985 when Jim was 13, and we'd spent a summer painting our old apartment, splattering each other with white paint until we were laughing so hard we couldn't breathe. He'd been my partner then, my boy, and I'd thought we'd always be a team. Losing that hurt, but finding Luke, building this new life, was a gift I hadn't expected. I saw Jim in Luke's quiet humor, his stubborn streak, and though Jim hadn't come to the hearing, I held a small hope he'd find his way back, not for me, but for his son. Luke was healing too, in his own way. He'd stopped flinching at loud noises, his shoulders no longer hunched like he was bracing for a fight. One night, he showed me another drawing a portrait of me, sitting by the window, my knitting in my lap, the light soft around me. "It's how I see you," he said, his voice shy. I blinked back tears, holding the paper like it was treasure. "You make me look better than I am," I said, my voice thick. "Nah," he said, grinning. "That's just you, Grandma." I kept that drawing close, taping it above the sink, a reminder of the love we'd found. But I wasn't naive. Temporary custody was just that, temporary, and the future held questions I couldn't answer. Could I afford this place long term? Would Lydia and Jim fight back? I pushed those worries down, focusing on the present. On the small victories, Luke's laughter, a new sketch, a shared meal. One afternoon, I started writing in a notebook, something I hadn't done since I was a girl. I wrote about Maple Street, about the phone call, about Luke and the courthouse. It wasn't for anyone else, just me, a way to make sense of the storm and the light that followed. I'd sit by the window, the neon sign flickering, and let the words spill out, my pen moving like Luke's pencil. It felt like healing, like reclaiming the Maggie I'd almost lost. I think of my mother's kitchen, the smell of her coffee, the way she'd hum Ella Fitzgerald as she baked. "You make a way, Maggie," she'd say. I was making a way now, not just for Luke, but for myself. I'd started going to a community group at the library, sharing bits of my story with other women who'd faced their own storms. Their nods, their quiet Me Too-s, were a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone. One evening, as we ate peanut butter sandwiches, Luke looked at me and said, "You think we'll be okay?" Like, long term. I set my sandwich down, the neon glow soft through the blinds. "I don't know what long term looks like," I said, honest. "But I know we've got each other, and that's more than I had a few months ago. We'll figure it out, one day at a time." He nodded, his eyes steady. "I like that," he said. "One day at a time." We finished our meal, the TV flickering with a Wheel of Fortune rerun, and I felt a peace settle over me. The apartment was small, the future uncertain, but it was ours, filled with sketches, laughter, and the stubborn hope that had carried us this far. I thought of Jim's text, of Lydia's handkerchief, and knew they were waking up to what they'd lost, but I wasn't waiting for their apologies. I had Luke, I had myself, and that was a family worth fighting for. As I washed the dishes, the faucet dripping, I looked at Luke's portrait above the sink and smiled. We weren't just surviving, we were living, and every day was a step toward light. I'd found my people, and I was holding them close, just like my mother taught me. The community center on Main Street smelled of old books and fresh coffee, a comforting mix that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I stood at the front of the room, my hands clasped around my mother's handkerchief. Its lace soft against my fingers. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and a dozen faces looked up at me, women with grey hair and laugh lines, a few younger ones with tired eyes, all waiting for my story. Outside, Willow Creek was waking up, the autumn leaves swirling in the breeze, the oaks along the street glowing gold in the morning light. I took a deep breath, my heart steady, and began. "My name's Maggie Harper," I said, my voice soft but clear, "and I'm here to tell you about a storm I walked through, and the light I found on the other side. If you've been with me from the cold nights of Maple Street, through the courtroom's quiet victory and the small apartment on Cedar Avenue, you know this journey was never just about me. It was about Luke, the boy who saw me when no one else did, and about the family we built from the ashes of the one that broke us. It was about learning, at 62, that you're never too old to find your voice, to love yourself, to make a home." As I stood in that room, sharing my story, I wasn't just Maggie Harper, the woman who'd been pushed out. I was Maggie, the one who'd kept walking, who'd found light beyond the storm, and I wanted others to find it too. It had been a month since the judge granted me temporary custody of Luke, and our life in the apartment had grown roots. The space was still small, the walls thin enough to hear the nail tech's laughter from glamour nails, but it was ours, filled with the warmth of our days. I'd wake each morning to the drip of the faucet, make Folgers coffee, and watch the sun slip through the blinds, painting stripes across the linoleum. Luke would stumble out of his blankets, his hair a mess, and we'd eat oatmeal or peanut butter toast, trading quiet jokes over the wobbly table we'd claimed as our own. The TV hummed with Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune, a soft backdrop to our laughter, and the air smelled of bread and hope. Luke was thriving, his sketches piling up on the dresser, his voice steadier with each passing day. He'd come home from art club with stories of new projects, his hands smudged with charcoal, his eyes bright with ideas. One evening, he showed me a drawing, a small apartment with two figures at a table, light streaming through a window. "It's us," he said, his grin shy but proud. I held the paper, my throat tight. "It's perfect. Luke," I said, taping it above the sink, next to his street scene and our grocery list. "This is home." He nodded, his smile widening. "Yeah," he said, "it really is." Those moments were our foundation, but healing wasn't just in the big wins. It was in the small things, the way Luke stopped flinching at loud noises, the way he'd hum Green Day songs while doing homework, the way we'd laugh over burnt mac and cheese. I was healing too, finding pieces of myself I'd lost in the shadows of Maple Street. I'd started writing in a notebook, pouring out the pain and the hope, the storm and the light. I'd knit by the window, the neon sign buzzing outside, and feel a peace I hadn't known in years. The apartment was our sanctuary, a place where we could be Maggie and Luke, not the outcasts they'd made us. The past wasn't gone, though. Jim's text, "Mom, you okay?" still sat unanswered in my phone. A quiet ache I wasn't ready to face. Claire's delivery of my handkerchief, left at the salon with a note, felt like Lydia's attempt to reach out, but it wasn't enough to mend what they'd broken. I didn't hate them, not anymore. I'd let go of the anger somewhere between the courthouse and Cedar Avenue. But forgiveness was a slow road, and I was still walking it. I kept the handkerchief in my pocket, its lace a reminder of my mother's strength, and focused on Luke, on the life we were building. I think back to 1979 when Jim was 6, and we'd spent a summer at the Willow Creek Fair, eating cotton candy under the stars. He'd clung to my hand, his laughter bright, and I'd thought, this is enough. I'd lost that boy somewhere along the way. But I'd found Luke, and he was teaching me what family really meant. I saw Jim in Luke's quiet humor, his stubborn streak, And though Jim hadn't reached out again, I held a small hope he'd find his way, not for me, but for his son. The community group at the library had become my lifeline, a place where I could share my story and hear others. The women there, some widowed, some estranged, some starting over, listened with nods and soft smiles, their own stories echoing mine. One afternoon, I stood before them, my notebook open, and read a passage I'd written about leaving Maple Street. I thought I was failing when I walked away. I said, my voice steady, but I was surviving. I was choosing myself. And then I chose Luke. And that's what I want you to know, whatever storm you're in. You can find light. You're never too old to start again. A woman in the back, her hair silver like mine, raised her hand. How do you keep going, she asked, her voice trembling. When it feels like everyone's against you. I smiled, clutching the handkerchief. You find one thing to hold on to, I said. For me, it was Luke and my mother's voice, telling me I was enough. Find your thing and let it carry you. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and I felt a warmth spread through me, like I'd given her a piece of my light. Sharing my story wasn't just for me, it was for them, for anyone who'd felt small, who'd been told they didn't matter. I was learning that my voice, the one I'd silenced for so long, could lift others too. Luke was part of that light. One night, as we ate peanut butter sandwiches on the floor, he looked at me and said, You think we'll stay here forever? Like, in this apartment, I set my sandwich down. The neon glows soft through the blinds. Maybe not forever, I said, honest. But we'll stay together. Wherever we go, that's what matters. He nodded, his eyes steady. I like that, he said. You're kind of my hero. Grandma. I laughed, my heart full. You're mine. Luke, I said. Always have been. He grinned, passing me a slice of bread, and we ate in silence, the TV flickering with a Wheel of Fortune rerun. The apartment was small, but it was alive with us Luke's sketches, my knitting, the smell of coffee and toast. It was a home, not because of the walls, but because of the love we'd poured into it. I kept writing, my notebook filling with memories and hopes. I'd sit by the window, the neon sign buzzing, and let the words flow about the phone call, the courthouse. The way Luke's laughter felt like spring after a long winter. I didn't know if I'd ever share it beyond the group, but it was mine. A record of the woman I'd become. I'd started saving a little, dreaming of a bigger place someday, maybe with a real kitchen and a bed for Luke. The future was uncertain, but it didn't scare me anymore. I had Luke, I had myself, and that was enough. One morning, as I made coffee, Luke came in, his sketchbook under his arm. I drew something for you, he said, handing me a sheet of paper. It was a portrait of us, sitting at the table, the apartment glowing with light, a tree outside the window blooming with flowers that didn't exist in November. It's how I see us, he said, his voice shy. I held it, tears pricking my eyes. It's beautiful. Luke, I said, taping it above the sink. It's everything. He smiled, grabbing a Pop-Tart, and I felt a peace settle over me, deep and steady. I thought of my mother's kitchen, the smell of her oatmeal cookies, the way she'd hum along to Ella Fitzgerald. You make a way, Maggie, she'd say. I'd made a way. Through pain and loss, to this moment, this home. I'd walked through a storm and found light. Not because I was fearless, but because I was stubborn. Because I loved. Because I believed in something bigger than their words. I stood at the community center, finishing my story. The women's eyes on me, some wet with tears, some bright with hope. I learned something at 62. I said, my voice steady. You're never too old to find your light, to love yourself, to make a home. Whatever storm you're in, keep walking, you're worth it. And there's light waiting for you. They clapped, a soft sound that filled the room, and I felt my mother's smile in my heart. I was Maggie Harper, and I'd found my people, Luke, these women, myself. The storm was behind me, and the light was here, in the laughter, the sketches, the quiet mornings with coffee and hope. As I walked home, the oaks glowing in the autumn sun, I thought of Jim's text, of Lydia's handkerchief, and knew they were waking up to what they'd lost. But I wasn't waiting for their apologies. I had Luke, I had my story, and I was living, not just surviving. The road ahead was open, and I was ready. My mother's handkerchief in my pocket, Luke's drawings on my wall, and a heart full of light. Well, my friends, that's the story of Maggie and Luke, two souls who found light after the storm. As I sit here in Eufaula, sipping my Folgers, I can almost see him in that little apartment, laughing over burnt toast, their sketches on the wall, building a home from love alone. Maggie learned at 62 what I hope you'll hear. Now you're never too old to choose yourself, to find your people, to shine. They're still out there in Willow Creek, living one day at a time, proof that storms don't last forever. So, take a page from Maggie's book, Keep Walking, keep loving, keep believing. If this touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and share your own light in the comments. Let's keep these stories alive, together, like old friends round the table. Until next time, y'all.